Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
I'm Nancy.
And the topic for this episode is the gut-brain connection. And particularly we're going to be talking about the microbiota and the microbiota gut-brain connection, as some people call it. So for this, we read Mind-Altering Microorganisms, The Impact of the Gut Microbiota on Brain and Behavior, and that's by John Cryan and Timothy Deenan, and it's a Nature Neuroscience review from 2012. This topic was actually brought up the last time that Nancy was on our show. She was talking about how she went to a symposium at a conference and kind of serendipitously learned about the fact that the gut can impact anxiety and other things. And it is the case that it seems like a lot of this research is about the impact of the state of the gut on anxiety. But we're going to first kind of just lay out the general anatomy of the gut-brain connection and then talk about how alterations to the gut can alter the brain and other behaviors and things. So basically the nervous system is divided into two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And so the central is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is basically like everything else, the receptors in your skin and all of that kind of stuff. And then within the peripheral, there are further subdivisions. And so that includes the autonomic nervous system. And so that's the part that we'll be talking about. And that's the part that controls smooth muscles and organs. As opposed to things like your skeletal muscles that actually help you move. This is more the internal system. And it is further decomposed into the sympathetic system, the parasympathetic system, and the enteric system. And so the enteric is the one that has to do with the gut. But the enteric system is also kind of modulated and interacts with the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so you may have heard about the sympathetic and parasympathetic because the sympathetic system is called the fight or flight system, which responds under kind of stressful circumstances where you need to fight or flight. And then obviously after that term was thought up, they had to come up with a rhyming term for the parasympathetic system, and so that is known as the rest and digest system, which is yes. Not as commonly referred to. And this there's a second term that they talk about or that I saw, which I definitely hadn't heard before, and that is the feed and breed system for parasympathetic, because it is also involved in sexual responses.
Feed and breed, that's good.
Yeah. So those two systems are kind of opposing things in some general framework. They kind of do opposite stuff to the body to keep things in balance. And then we have the enteric system, which is what controls the muscles of the gut. So whenever you eat, you have some muscles that kind of actively push the food through your system. It's called peristalsis. And these muscles take care of that. And then there's also all these sensory neurons that tell the brain what's happening in the gut. And that has led people to think of this enteric nervous system as a second brain because there's so much going on there. And there are actually kind of complex input and output systems. It can respond to the state of things and move the food around in certain ways. And there are actually 500 million neurons in the human gut. And so that is 0.5% of the neurons in the human brain. So that's not a bad number. It's 5 times as many neurons in the spinal cord.
Wow.
So I think second brain is a reasonable name for the gut.
I guess people kind of have a colloquial notion that if there's a lot of neurons, then it's like a really smart or intelligent area. I don't know. I mean, the way this
You're not impressed.
Well, no. It's like your skin. Your skin also has a lot of neurons, right? Like sensory neurons. Mm-hmm. And so you could think of the skin as like, is the skin intelligent, or is the skin just, it's big and so it requires a lot of like sensory neurons?
Yeah.
And the same thing you could think of as maybe being true for the stomach, right? The stomach is like it's kind of a motor system, right? It requires.
And this is like esophagus all the way through to anus.
Yeah.
Which is kind of another rhyming. Not as great of a rhyme.
Yeah, I see what Josh says, which is like essentially you're covering a lot of area, especially when the intestines aren't, isn't it like feet and feet?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So you do need a lot of different nerves that are going to be innervating all of that space. So it could be something related to the volume or large area.
I mean, I don't really like snakes very much, so I don't want to use this. But like, you could think of the whole digestive system as like like has as much musculature as a snake or something, right? You need to take food and move it via muscles and sensory system, and so motor and sensory kinds of neurons have to coordinate a whole like system of moving things along through the esophagus all the way down to.
I can't get past the fact that your fear of snakes is so strong that you can't even use them as a metaphor.
It's not bad. I did use it as.
You did, yeah. You got over your fear.
But not without remarking your dislike. It's like, I don't like them, but I'll use them to come.
Reluctantly.
It is more neurons than in a cat brain, I read somewhere in the human gut. But yeah, that's fair. I mean, I don't know what smart means, but I was reading this book about octopuses and how they have these kind of distributed nervous systems that have little ganglia of neurons out in their arms. And like, do they have a brain, or are they like a system of small brains? And I think we talked about this on our consciousness episode. Like, is the gut conscious? How could you know? I mean, it's a network of neurons the size of a cat brain, so who knows? There's also 90% of the serotonin and 50% of the dopamine in the body is in the gut. So if sheer numbers make you think something is important, that one might work on you as well.
Do you have a basic understanding of what serotonin and dopamine do in the gut?
No. I don't know that I have a basic understanding of what they do in the brain.
I'm not sure. Well, yeah, but like, are there the same serotonin receptors that we have in the brain? Are they in the gut? Or, like, are they binding to receptors, or are they doing something slightly different?
So it was clear there is some binding to receptors, and there are some nerves which transmit signals to the central nervous system via the gut generally, right? But I don't know so many details of this.
But there's the vagus nerve that is a very long nerve. It goes from the brain through the chest all the way down to the colon, and it kind of integrates a lot of stuff about the body, and it can then control stuff in return. So it has a lot of chemoreceptors in different parts of the GI tract and other areas, and it's responsible for controlling heart rate and things about the intestinal tract, as well as the gag reflex and sweating and vomiting. So this is,
and as I understand, right, like this uses the same neurotransmitters, so I think it is responsive to neurotransmitters in the periphery, and the motor side of the vagus nerve can regulate heart rate. And they originally discovered, was it acetylcholine this way?
That sounds right, but I'm not certain.
They called it Vegas stuff. Like, no, like it was like a German. I'm mispronouncing the German. But
yeah, you definitely are.
But it's it's the stuff of the Vegas, right? Yeah. And was this acetylcholine? Maybe I should fact check that one.
I can check it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you guys are aware or not. I don't know the details of the research, but my sense is that vagus nerve stimulation seems to be, quote unquote, somewhat. I think it's almost magical because it helps with a lot of things in different animal models and even for patients. Like, I think it's used a lot in treatment. And perhaps it's because it innervates so many different things through the body. It seems like if you stimulate it...
So where do they stimulate it? Is it chemically or electrically?
Electrically. They stimulate it electrically,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I thought, like, I had heard about the vagus nerve as being kind of an important center in styles of medicine that weren't necessarily trustworthy. Like, I feel like I've heard a yoga teacher talk about the vagus nerve or something like that. But you're saying that there's actual science.
Yeah, there's actual research. Yeah. Because it's so translatable that, you get stimulated vagus nerve in a human.
But this is moderately invasive, or?
Moderately invasive, yeah. So it's not completely non-invasive, but it's moderately invasive. Yeah. Less invasive than, saying, deep brain stimulation.
Sure, yeah.
So the vagus nerve does release acetylcholine.
Yeah.
So that was probably what it was called at the time. So that's an important pathway for sure. But as some of these studies show, it's actually not the only way in which stuff happening in the gut can impact the nervous system in the brain. Because there's also kind of the immune system that's tied in, and just hormonal signaling systems that can have different effects.
Again, like, to sort of, I felt like this paper, while it did a very good job of surveying it, I don't know, it wasn't clear to me if it impacted things, like, in a certain way. Like, it almost felt like it was framing it as though obviously people who are real biologists don't believe that the system is designed, but it almost felt like they were framing it as purposive, like there was intentional signaling from the microbiota to the brain, like via the immune system. And my read is maybe it's just like, oh yeah, there's an immune response because there's like chemicals being released by microorganisms in your gut. And so I just wanted to be like, I wasn't clear how much we should be differentiating between these being sort of coincidental secondary effects of what's going on in the gut. Like, is it, should we think of it as signaling from, I mean, they frame it a little bit as signaling from the gut to the central nervous system via the immune system. But like, it seems plausible that an appropriate characterization of that might also be you get an immune response and that affects your central nervous system.
Yeah, I think it's clear that it's only semantics as to whether you say that signaling or not.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, like it is signaling under the loose definition of signaling, where it's just like any communication that happens, but
I didn't
it's not
read
like,
it that way, like one organism signaling the other. So that's interesting. Yeah.
I didn't read it that way either. I didn't feel like they were taking a stance on that either way. I thought they were just describing there is this immune response that happens when the gut gets inflamed, and that could be how the gut ends up impacting behavior.
Okay, fine. So maybe I was the only one who was imputing some sort of purposive intentionality to the signaling.
Right. So those are kind of the basics of the gut's nervous system, the second brain, if you want to call it. And then, as I said earlier, a lot of what is talked about is actually the impact of the microbiota that lives in the gut. So this is the collection of microorganisms that live in your gut. And a lot of research is about how changes in that population go on to impact the brain and behavior. And also, apparently, so when I hear about this, because I think you hear about the impact of microorganisms a lot these days, because there's been a lot of research even outside of neuroscience things related to how the gut bacteria can impact your health. And I feel like I usually hear the word microbiome as like referring to the population of gut stuff. But they said that microbiome is the collection of genomes of the organisms. So the organisms are the microbiota, and the microbiome refers to the genomes of those organisms, which I hadn't actually heard as the definition before. So there are 10 to the 14th microorganisms in your gut. And so that's like individual cells, and that is 10 times the number of cells in your body. So people talk about like your body is not mostly you because it's full of bacteria and other microorganisms. And
I'm just going to quibble some more. I'm just going to keep sitting here on the sidelines. But it is the case, right, that like different cells are different size, which is something that I feel like it's sometimes it's easy to forget. And like certainly as a non-scientist, I don't think before I got into science, I don't think I appreciated that cells like dramatically vary in size. So this is also like kind of interesting of a statement, but like certainly by mass and like by the volume of your total cell occupying space, you're mostly you, not the bacteria.
Yeah, don't worry, Josh.
It's like there's presumably a bunch of tiny cells.
Yeah, they're tiny.
I think that bacteria generally are small. So that caveat aside.
Yeah, that very necessary caveat aside.
It seems like it was interesting. They were talking about how there are kind of different individuals have different profiles of their gut organisms. And they said there was 3 main, they call them enterotypes, that are different like profiles of the type of bacteria that you have. And there's these 3 different ones that correspond to kind of 3 different major species that you would have in your gut. And some of them relate to diet. So Bacteroidetes, oh God. I knew this was going to be a problem. But these are the kind that are associated with a high-fat and high-protein diet. And then Prevotella, which is a lot easier to pronounce and sounds like a pasta, is ironically related to a high-carb diet. So that's how I'm going to choose to remember it. And then there's a third kind that's common, but they didn't say what food you eat to have that as your dominant one. So they talk about how these different types of bacteria are more common in different people. And then they also talk about like the role of different types of bacteria in anxiety and all of that kind of stuff, and how they impact the gut in different ways. So, well, one thing is that I just felt like you could make a personality test based on these different profiles. Like, you take a quiz on what you eat and like, tell you what your gut probably looks like.
That would be great.
There's probably already like a Facebook quiz like this or something.
Yeah, it might already exist because there is a big market of probiotics and things like that. So
yeah, it is the case that this, I think by research standards, all of this gut microbiome stuff is like pretty new, but it really went to market very quickly. I think like people were ready to believe that eating yogurt would impact, their anxiety.
Doesn't it feel like a lot of the most successful science is like stuff that people kind of already believe, and as soon as there's a paper about it, they'll just be enthusiastic whether or not the
what do
work
you mean
is,
by successful, Josh? You mean popular?
Yeah, popular. Like sometimes very popular work is partly influences what's going on, but also partly kind of rides or surfs like the wave of things that are already popular.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between the gut and the brain has been popular for like millennia, I think. And you see it in our language. And like I think for a while people thought that like the soul was in the gut, right?
Or
not the head. Or the heart, I guess.
But,
yeah. So it certainly is intuitive, I think. Oh, and I also think that it's just like people want a somewhat easy answer to problems. So if you have anxiety or obesity or other problems and someone tells you like you just need to eat probiotics, then like of course you like want to believe that and be willing to try it.
Oh, something happened to me. It must be what I ate. That's a very normal association that people make.
Yeah, I think that comes up in Sartre. Yeah, I think in nausea, there's like a lot of talk about, oh, I had a bad bit of meat and then I had a nightmare or something like that.
Yeah, and I can actually very much relate to that. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, like, I've noticed that what you choose to eat, and certainly, like, when you choose to eat it, can affect the quality of your sleep. But also, and you can explain it arguably as, like, oh, just, like, how much blood has, went to your stomach, and this is, maybe partly the motivation for people drinking caffeine after lunch to, like, I don't know, do something to get blood back to their brain so they can focus.
Yeah, and what is that Nietzsche quote about?
It's something to the effect of, man might think he were a god if only he didn't have a stomach.
Yes.
Or something like that.
Yeah. So just the idea that for a long time the gut has vexed people and impacted their mood strongly.
It's very intuitive, and it's also something that's not really scary to change what you eat just to see what happens. It's pretty.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It feels very natural.
Exactly.
As a potential solution. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people are always willing to change what they eat. Like there's always fad diets and stuff like that. So it's definitely within the realm of things that people are ready to explore. So basically, as we said before, a lot of the research is about anxiety and also stress-related things. And I think, again, that's kind of in line with the intuition. Like, people talk about their stomach being in knots when they're stressed or something like that, or butterflies in their stomach. So it's not something that's surprising that there could actually be a relationship there. So part of kind of the basic anatomy that we didn't touch on yet is what's called the HPA Axis. And that stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so those are kind of there's two brain regions and then one gland near the kidneys that are connected in this signaling pathway that ultimately results in the release of cortisol. So it's kind of associated with the stress response. And the release of cortisol can then have all these effects on all different parts of the body, including the gut. So
just to be very clear, right, this is via the blood system. So like molecules of hormones are released into the blood and the communication happens through that.
Yeah, so it's the neuroendocrine system is what it's referred to. That's hormonal influences that are spread through the blood.
Physically, we're talking about, like when we're talking about this system, it's through the blood and it's hormones. When we're talking about like the vagus nerve, it's direct through neurons.
Yeah,
innervation.
And then there's the immune system, which also responds to like inflammation in the gut, has an immune component, and then that can lead to changes as well.
And that's also via the immune system, which is in the bloodstream as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And one thing about the immune system, though, is that the cytokines are messengers, quote unquote, of the immune system, but there's actually receptors in the brain that this was maybe started to become a boom in research in early 2000s of the different cytokines, such as like IL-1, IL-6, all of these factors that actually have effects in neural activity and such, or
and
gene
so
expression.
the cytokines are, there are at least some of them are released during inflammation of the gut, is what I got from this. They're related to inflammation. I don't remember the causality, actually. But yeah, so you have this HPA axis that is heavily involved in the stress response in the body. And so the communication between the gut microbiota and the brain and the nervous system is bidirectional. So there's observations of changes in gut organisms leading to changes in anxiety or behavior. And then also the stress response, the activation of this HPA axis can lead to changes in the gut population. So something that has been done experimentally in animals is inducing stress via, in young animals, you can induce it via maternal separation. So they take the pups away from the mom for some amount of time. And that, they said, can lead to changes in the gut microbiota that last into adulthood. And so that includes things like decreases in some of the major categories of bacteria that usually exist in adult mice. They call it changes in gut flora, which I find really disgusting as a term. It makes me think of like flowers blooming inside of my stomach. I guess it's better than gut fauna, which would be the other option, but neither of those images is good. So it's also the case that in addition to affecting the microbiota, the stress can also affect like the integrity of the intestinal system. Like the walls become leaky, they say. The intestinal barrier becomes leaky. And then that can lead to things showing up in the blood that I think are a result of the barrier breaking down. And that can lead to other effects. But they say that probiotics can build the lining back up. So if you have like a leaky lining because of stress, if you eat probiotics, it can help restore it. And another definition that I learned from this was that probiotics is just any living organism that has a beneficial health effect when you eat it, which is a much more vague definition than I thought it was. I thought there were some particular properties of the organism itself, not just empirically it was good after you ate it.
Well, that's interesting. That's a living organism. So it makes me wonder if on the supplements, are they alive?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how regulated the term is.
That's a good point. Oh, also, like, besides that study with early life stress, also stress in adulthood can affect the composition of the microbiota. And it can be reversed by the probiotics as well.
So we've talked about some of the findings. Actually, one thing to me that's interesting is discussing where some of the evidence for these results come from. So, like, you might think naively that if you're studying something like this, you would be looking mostly at people or something like this. And I guess that's a fairly uncontrolled setting. And so, like, if you were studying people, the criticism that I would be quick to levy against the work would be like, if there's some healthy person and they have some certain kind of microbiome, couldn't it just be a consequence of their extremely low-fat diet or something like this? And so that person is eating a certain way and possibly exercising a certain way, and it's like they also have a correlated microbiome. But like, would you be confident that like it's really the microbiome has any causality? And this literature has like lots of work with rodents, basically, where they've done a bunch of different things, either eliminating all of the bacteria in the gut by giving it antibiotics, basically, raising it in raising the animals in environments where they're basically sterile, so they do not pick up a biota. And they've also done, I mean, the study that to me was one of the most interesting single studies cited in this was one in which they took different kinds of rodent and transferred the biota of one to a sterile version of the other rodent.
Yeah, I think we should break down exactly the methods that they use, because it is pretty cool and I think difficult, especially so you referenced the idea of being in a sterile environment so that they don't end up having a gut microbiota, but that's dependent on a previous finding that this is something that happens postnatally. So you can imagine that you are born with, the gut microbiota that perhaps your mother had, and, it is part of your development during gestation. But in fact, it's the case that these animals seem to be born without microbiota profile, and they talk about the first exposure being during passing through the vaginal canal and getting exposed to the microorganisms there. And then from then on, I think, so there was a finding that said at 1 year of age, there's an adult-like profile of microbiota in the gut. I'm pretty sure that was a human finding.
Yeah, that's definitely
matter. Yeah,
that's definitely humans.
Yeah, they age much faster, so it has different meaning. So within 1 year, there's kind of the adult-like profile that occurs. But if you take these mice right when they're born, or I guess maybe they do like a C-section on the mother, and then raise them in a completely sterile environment, which I imagine is very difficult to do, but they do it. Then you can really see what this component of biology does in terms of development and kind of behaviors into adulthood.
And in some cases, though, they talk about reversible effects, where like you can reversibly modulate behavior by transiently changing the microbiota of a particular organism.
I didn't get a chance to look at the original papers, but that paragraph I wrote amazing next to it, and it is true. Someone could argue like, oh, but it's like very basic behaviors. It says here exploratory behaviors. It's still amazing, even if it was just simple like.
So I actually did take a quick look at part of that paper. It sounds like what they did in the paper was they took two species of rodent, and they were able to transfer what was normally the microbiota of one into another. And I guess these different species of rodent have different levels of certain kinds of anxiety-related behaviors.
Which is its own interesting thing, because, well, they have different microbiota naturally, so it speaks to a genetic component to the regulation of the microbiota.
Yeah, so like maybe you can infect or colonize the gut of one of the kinds of species transiently, but like given enough time, it'll kind of go back to the one that it's more customary for it. But the assessment metrics, apparently there's something called a step-down task, which is fairly common for studying anxiety in rodents and exploratory behavior, which is like you put the rodent somewhere, and like how long does it take before it steps down from this elevated area or whatever. And so if it's quick to step down, you would say that it is like more exploratory than one that stays up there. And like staying up there probably, I think they also say sometimes relates to anxiety or something like this. So that was like an example. There was also a light response based stimulus, like
maybe like a light dark box. Let's see.
Correct. Yeah. It was a light. So they were two very simple, very basic measures, and they saw some changes.
So they took these two different species of mice, reared some of them in the germ-free sterile environment, and then took the microbiota of some that were reared in a normal environment and gave it to the germ-free ones. And if you give the same species, if you transfer from the same species that was raised normally to the one that was germ-free, you get behavior that's aligned with that species in these exploratory tasks. And if you transfer from the opposite species, you get behavior that's aligned with the opposite species in these tasks, was the general finding that they had.
Right, so that's pretty convincing.
Yeah.
And so like to me, this was striking as a result, partly because like, again, like coming into this topic, my intuition would have been like, if you're studying this in humans, isn't it the case that there are so many confounding factors, like the other environmental variables that produce the microbiota? So with these animal studies, you can do something kind of strange and control what's actually in the gut, and you can change it, and you can like either developmentally or transiently, even for mature animals, see changes in behavior. I mean, if these findings continue to bear out, where there are like statistically significant differences as you change the microbiome, that's fairly compelling, and it's kind of hard to argue that it's like other stuff. They've done like a lot of these. They even talk very explicitly about the kinds of controls, that they do here.
I mean, yeah, obviously all studies in humans are incredibly difficult. You can't pull out clean things from them, so you need these controlled animal studies to say anything definitively. Good luck trying to raise a human in a sterile environment. But actually related to the cross-species study, Nancy, I wanted to ask you, do you normally work with just a single mouse line, like a single species?
So through my in my PhD, I work with the main strain of mice, and that strain of mice was different from the strain of mice that most people used, and their behavior baseline was very different. So for me, the fact that different strains of mice have different levels of exploratory behavior that are like statistically different, that doesn't surprise me. It's something that's a problem-ish. It can become a problem, but it is a reality that their exploratory behavior of different mice and like their fear levels and their anxiety levels and how aggressive they are. Right now, I'm exploring different strains of mice to see which of them is easiest, to read out their aggressive behavior and dominance behavior. So different strains of mice behave very differently, even though they're the same species.
Yeah, that's the thing that was worrying to me when I saw this, is that they can be baseline so different. And it seems like a lot of labs, use one strain, and there's a few strains that are popular. And then it also said in here that a lot of the findings are only true in male mice. So if you do a bunch of studies on one strain of mice and only use males, which is not uncommon, you could get very biased findings.
That is true. And there is like a common strain that most people use, and most people use it because other people use it. So there is like a majority. I would say the majority, the animal that's represented in the majority is a C57 male mouse, is very well represented. Not the female that much, and other strains of mice less so. And these just to point out how incredible variable the behavior is, these lines of mice are inbreds, even though they're inbreds. Or perhaps because they're inbreds, there is these levels of differences. Maybe that's why.
Yeah, they're like getting very weird. Like the royal people in England or whatever, when they were inbred for centuries. They got really extreme looking.
You're picking on England in specific?
No, well, that's the only one that I'm used to hearing about. It was all of them. They were all inbreds.
So, kind of like a note though, I'm not sure. I think you mentioned this, Josh, that one type of study in which scientists have been addressing the microbiota gut-brain axis is transplantation studies. They're starting to do transplantation studies in humans.
Yeah.
So people donate their fecal matter for studies.
As far as I understand, there's one gastrointestinal disorder.
C. diff, I think.
Is it?
I thought so.
Yeah.
So it's like I think it's common for people who are in the hospital for a long time to get C. diff, which is like a terrible infection that is very bad. And one of the promising treatments for it now is fecal transplant.
And I think that already actually works.
I think it is. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these things, when they're new and they work well at all, might end up being overstated. I think it only works for some people, but when it works for them, it works really well. That was my understanding.
Interesting.
So people will
So the basic procedure, right, is like, so the context is you're in a hospital, you're probably on antibiotics, and your gut microbiota gets pretty messed up. And you are then susceptible to a certain kind of infection. And it causes a bunch of problems for you. And the treatment right now is like one treatment that seems to be relatively effective, at least at present, is to do fecal transplantation, where you basically take the gut bacteria from a different person who's healthy and transplant it to your gut.
Yeah. And then now you're healthy.
And
you just needed like a little starter, you know, it's like sourdough. Yeah. And I think I've heard of like a DIY version. Like people are kind of taking it out. Like they're like, oh, that's a simple treatment. I could, you know, make that happen. If they don't want to go to a hospital or if a hospital isn't offering it to them. I've heard of people doing it themselves.
Wow.
Which I can't imagine is recommended. But one of the things that came out of these germ-free studies was they showed that the mice that are raised in the sterile environment, they had, when you gave them some like stressful stimulus, like if you restrain them, that's a stressful stimulus, their HPA Axis, this stress response system, was overactive compared to normal mice, but they also showed lower levels of anxiety by behavioral measures. So I think it points to the complications of screwing up development because you don't actually know what you're doing. Because if the animal has developed in this system that doesn't have a microbiota, then it's hard to interpret what the developed system, like what something means in that system. Does the stress response mean the same thing in an animal that never had gut microorganisms? It might not. At least this kind of discrepancy between the stress response and the anxiety behavior would suggest that perhaps it doesn't mean the same thing in those animals.
Yeah, what the way I interpret that, because it does seem like a discrepancy, like they have a very strong stress response in the HPA axis, but lower anxiety levels. The way I quickly explained it to myself was with the fact that they also have cognitive deficits. So I'm like, oh, okay, they have cognitive deficits, so they're not avoiding potential dangers that other smarter animals may avoid. That's the way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was the case that another effect of the germ-free animals was that they had a decrease in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like a chemical that induces the growth and survival of neurons. And they also had a decrease in NMDA receptors, which are kind of associated with learning. And then, relatedly, they did show deficits in working memory tasks. So, yeah, it could be just that they have, like, they feel the stress and anxiety the same as the normal mice, but they don't translate it into behavior. And so it doesn't show up on the anxiety measures. They also, in this review, they kind of acknowledged that there should be more tests of the behavior of these animals that are sterile to like really see what's going on, especially because they have this surprising anxiety finding. And I just liked the sentence that they said after they advocate for that. They say, but maintaining animals in a germ-free environment and conducting complex behavioral studies is not a trivial logistic hurdle. It's just like such a polite science way of being like, it's hard. You do it. So I'm going to use that the next time like my reviewers ask for something too difficult. Like that is not a
trivial matter.
Trivial logistic hurdle.
So I thought it was really interesting that I saw a pattern of, okay, so they see something that the manipulating the microbiome affects something in behavior, and it seems like patterning across many of the studies cited is that to know if the mechanism is related to the brain, they got rid of the vagus nerve. And
yeah,
that also seems not a trivial logistic hurdle.
That's true.
Like extract the vagus nerve from.
I don't know. I think this is me like reaching way back into like my undergrad education. I thought there was a way of like clamping it that wasn't so difficult, but I could be really making that up.
Maybe they put like TTX on it.
Oh, yeah. So they just like chemically poison it. But yeah, that was interesting to see. It seemed like different types of bacteria, their effect was dependent on the vagus nerve or not.
Yes.
It wasn't even like a universal finding, like, oh yeah, this is done via the endocrine system. It's like, no, sometimes it's the vagus nerve and sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's both. Actually, it's probably always both. And then also the immune system too.
And sometimes the immune system, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Some combination of all of those in different proportions.
So I've recently consumed probiotics, but not for these reasons. And now I'm like, wait a minute. So then I was, as they had studies, as I was reading the different studies, I was like Googling and seeing if there were probiotics for that. So my question to you guys, if you wanted to reduce your anxiety, would you be open to taking like a cocktail of existing probiotics that's in there? I'm just curious.
I don't think that I would take it in like a pill form, because I think there's reason to believe that a lot of supplements don't work very well. I am more trusting of yogurt.
So you would find it,
which is like they've ground a pill into the manufacture of that yogurt.
I just, I have a lot of faith in Jamie Lee Curtis, and I don't think she would advertise yogurt if it didn't work.
I see.
She was the main one in the early days on the Activia commercials. But yeah, I mean, I don't. It's that thing where it's like, yeah, sure, whatever, I'll try it. I don't, and it probably has a good placebo effect. So.
I mean, kind of what's interesting to me about thinking about this literature is that we've talked about how some of it feels rather intuitive. Like, even, like, clearly if your stomach, like, what's going on in your stomach is going to make you feel different, certainly. So, like, if, I don't know, it's not hard to imagine, like, when they talk about a rodent not exploring as much or something like this, that maybe it has to do with, like, they feel bloated or something like this. And I mean, like, obviously that's reaching, and that's too much anthropomorphizing. I don't know. It feels like you can kind of explain a lot of this in ways where it's like, yes, the communication between the gut and the brain is like how fatigued you are, or like.
But that doesn't hold up to the vagus nerve.
No, I agree. It's not. Complete.
It's not just like some sensation.
Yeah, no, and I'm not trying to like. We experientially receive an enormous amount of information from our gut. Is all I'm trying to say. Like, I don't know what it feels like, per se, to receive a signal via the vagus nerve versus the endocrine system. But I'm sure, like, that's the kind of thing which I think very plausibly reaches conscious awareness, right? Just, like, some of this, like, we are aware when we're full and our stomach feels distended, right? That is a direct signal from the gut to our brain.
Yeah, it does feel, compared to... your brain is doing a fair amount of sensing of bodily situations, and it does seem like you feel the gut more than you feel other stuff.
And, I mean, you feel it even when it's not just about, like, how full you are. You can, like, how much of the satiety feeling is partly derived from the gut, right? Like, if you just ate a very fatty meal and it feels heavy, partly, as I said before, that's like blood rushing to your stomach. But perhaps part of that satiety is also signaling from the gut. I mean, people know about this, so I'm speculating about something that I'm simply ignorant of. But
there's changes in peptides that end up signaling neuropeptides in the brain. Like, things go up when you eat a lot of fat, and then that thing binds into the hypothalamus, and then you are sated.
Yeah,
and there's even stuff that happens like as soon as sugar hits your tongue. Stuff gets going digestively and in your brain.
So and I realize this is more comprehensive than that, but on some level, like, so going back to Nancy's question, would you be willing to, like, change what you eat or what kind of bacteria live in your gut in order to feel differently? Certainly it doesn't feel very strange to imagine that could happen. But precisely, I mean, it's not just like eat some generic yogurt that's got a random cocktail. Like, where the real science will come in, right, is like systematically trying to change the nature of an individual's microbiota for a long period of time and seeing if that has concerted positive effects. That would be a kind of personalized medicine that would be interesting. So, like, it would surprise me if there's really, like, one pill fits all for this, because, like, we're talking about how genes and various lifestyle choices affect precisely what bacteria you already start with. And presumably different people need it modulated in different directions.
So then you're envisioning more a future in which, like, they assay your microbiome and they're like, you're really deficient in this, so let's work on this.
Maybe your energy level would go up if you had this
whatever.
Extra bacteria or something, which that would be very tempting, I think.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it needs to be personalized.
There's some big guy at Stanford that I'm forgetting his name, and they have this big center for the genome of the microbiota, which I guess the microbiome, and they're getting people's microbiome, and they're doing this very, very comprehensive study on people's microbiomes, like multi-million, multi-lab study. So perhaps in 10 years, we'll be much closer.
Yeah, and it seems like people who have irritable bowel syndrome are like who is tested the most in this kind of stuff, which I guess makes sense. Like they have a need to, like they want treatment, so they're willing to try out different stuff. Because this had a lot of references to people with IBS and like probiotics given to them and how it shows some decrease in anxiety and other stuff like that. Oh, and then it was interesting, so we talked a lot obviously about the anxiety and stress. The other things that they referenced as being related, so they talked about pain being modulated by the gut bacteria population, and how, again, people with IBS have an increase in visceral pain processing. Like, I think this was assessed via neuroimaging or something. They claimed that people with IBS have stronger visceral pain activity, visceral pain-related activity, and that, again, giving them probiotics can decrease their abdominal pain, which would make sense if it's, like, acting on the problems there and decreasing inflammation or whatever it's doing.
Do they say that change in pain is because of a change in the microbiome?
I'm not sure. I don't know. They also said that visceral pain and psychological stress were like processed in very overlapping parts of the brain, which I'm not sure that I had heard that or agree with that. I'm not sure.
I am not sure either, because I'm not sure where pain is processed.
And then the other topic they discuss, and I guess we're not giving very much credit to, or too much airtime to, is obesity, right?
Yeah, the way that they talk about obesity here, it makes it seem like there isn't a lot of sound science on it. Whereas I think if you like Google microbiome stuff generally, you would think that obesity is like a major thing that's being tackled successfully via these kinds of mechanisms. When they raise these germ-free animals, they have lower body fat, and they also seem resistant to obesity induced via diet later in life.
Whoa.
Yeah, which seems important. But then they talk about these different ways of regulating food intake, the peripheral way and the central way, like peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. And I think that's referring to like sensations of hunger versus kind of psychological drives to eat. And it's not clear how the microbiota may impact those, but it seems like there's more evidence for peripheral effects than central. And then they talk about autism and how people with autism tend to have gastrointestinal issues. But it seemed like the causal direction was complicated because people with autism also use antibiotics at a higher rate, and they might have less traditional diets than the general population. So I'm not sure what the status of understanding autism that way is. And then the most surprising one to me was multiple sclerosis, that they find a relationship there. So if you raise mice in a germ-free environment, they are less susceptible to, there's a way of inducing MS in mice, and they seem less susceptible to that. And then also there's, I think, a strain of mice that will develop it naturally, and if they're raised germ-free, they're less likely to develop it. So I just never heard about that connection.
Yeah, those two are pretty unexpected.
But this does feel like a situation where, because it's somewhat new, it's really like fanning out. Like people who have been stuck in a rut in their research area hear about something new and think, well, let me see if that's related to my problem. And so we might be in a time where there are false positives that will eventually be kind of winnowed down, but I don't know.
Yeah, I have to say I'm guilty of that, because as I was reading this, I was like, thinking, I wonder how these like germ-free mice behave socially, so I was trying to connect it to my own studies.
That's interesting, because this is the kind of topic where when I read it, I feel like I read it more as a non-scientist than as a neuroscientist. I'm just like, oh, should I be eating differently?
I also read it like that. I also consider like, oh, wait, I have to find things with these bacteria. I want that effect. Because I'm not afraid, like, what's the worst that can happen if you have too much of a, probiotic, like, diarrhea? I'm not afraid of that. I'm okay with experimenting with myself.
Okay, any last thoughts on the gut microbiota axis?
For me, it's a very exciting line of research. And it's interesting how, even though it's quote unquote new on the research front, it feels so, intuitive and ancient in a way. And I can imagine a lot of people that are a little bit anti-research, let's say people that don't like vaccines, etc., being really happy about this type of research.
Yeah, I actually think for sort of similar reasons that it's nice that kind of good science seems to be being done on this. It's easy to like expect kind of like shamanism when it comes to this kind of thing, like people just proposing solutions that are poorly tested and kind of based on hearsay. And so to like actually try to sort through what about the microbiota affects mood, but also like just sort of standard health outcomes related to like, obesity and health. And I mean, things like irritable bowel syndrome also seem like there's a lot of kind of lay scientific speculation on this topic. So it's good to see real science being done that tries to address this and clarify.
So it's about time that, the research
catches up. I think it's hard. It makes sense. I mean, it does seem like it's a very complicated thing, and so I understand why it's difficult.
It is not a trivial logistical hurdle.
Yeah. I mean, being able to like control the bacteria concentration in the whole organism, like in their whole gut. I mean, this is very difficult to do. So I think it is impressive that the people are actually pulling this off.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Happy to have learned about it for my own health and for science.
Yeah, and for interesting conversations to come in the future with non-scientists as well.
I don't recommend talking about fecal transplants over dinner. That's my parting advice. All right. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.